By 1941, Britain believed it had survived the most dangerous phase of the war. The daylight air battles of 1940 had failed to break the Royal Air Force, and the German Luftwaffe had shifted its focus toward nighttime bombing. Cities burned, civilians died, but Britain endured. What Allied planners did not yet understand was that a far more dangerous phase of the air war was quietly beginning, one that unfolded almost entirely in darkness. Night bombing protected British crews from German fighters, but it also exposed a critical vulnerability. Navigation was difficult, formations scattered, aircraft flew predictable routes back toward the English coast. Into this darkness stepped a small group of German pilots tasked with an unprecedented mission, hunting bombers at night using emerging technology, fragmented radar guidance, and personal skill. Among them was one pilot whose effectiveness would alarm British commanders and briefly tilt the balance of the air war. He did not command fleets or shape grand strategy. He flew alone, often for hours, relying on discipline, patience, and precision. His success would not be measured in territory gained, but in aircraft destroyed and crews lost. For a time, that success came at a scale Britain could not easily absorb. The threat was not theoretical. Britain's war effort depended on its bomber force. Strategic bombing was not just retaliation. It was a promise to the public that Britain could strike back, that the war would not be decided solely on British soil. Every bomber lost represented not only men and machines, but confidence. German night fighters began to intercept bombers with increasing regularity, guided by ground controllers and crude airborne radar. This system was imperfect, fragile, and highly dependent on individual performance. And yet, in the hands of an exceptional pilot, it became devastating. British losses rose sharply. Entire crews vanished without trace. Squadrons returned with empty gaps where aircraft should have been. For Allied planners, the danger was not simply attrition. It was the realization that a single German innovation, paired with individual mastery, could undermine the bombing campaign before it reached decisive scale. This was not the collapse of a front, but something subtler and more dangerous, the slow strangling of a strategy Britain needed to survive. What made this pilot extraordinary was not recklessness, but restraint. Night combat demanded a level of discipline unknown in daylight fighting. There were no dogfights, no formations, no visual confirmation until the final moments. The margin for error was almost non-existent. Fuel, weather, and fatigue were constant threats. Yet night after night, he returned with confirmed victories. British intelligence began to notice patterns. Certain routes became deadlier than others. Certain time windows resulted in disproportionate losses. Quietly, without public acknowledgement, concern spread through Bomber Command. The fear was not that Germany would win the war overnight, but that Britain's most important offensive tool could be neutralized before it reached full strength. This pilot did not need to destroy Britain's cities or defeat its air force outright. He only needed to make the bombing campaign unsustainable. For a brief and unsettling period, that outcome no longer seemed impossible. The war had entered a phase where technology, doctrine, and individual brilliance intersected in dangerous ways. And in that narrow space, one German pilot came closer to changing the course of World War II than anyone in London was prepared to admit. By late 1941, British air planners could no longer dismiss the rising losses as coincidence or bad luck. Bomber Command's night operations were becoming increasingly dangerous, not because of flak alone, but due to a pattern of interceptions that pointed to something more organized and far more precise. Aircraft were being intercepted far from major targets, sometimes shortly after crossing the coast, sometimes deep inland on their return routes. Crews reported shadowy silhouettes closing in from below, sudden bursts of cannon fire, and then darkness again. There were no warning flares, no searchlights, no visible pursuit. For the first time, British commanders faced the reality that German night fighters were no longer operating blindly. They were being guided. Ground-controlled interception systems, combined with early airborne radar, were beginning to function as an integrated network. This network was fragile, incomplete, and highly dependent on individual pilots who could interpret sparse data in real time. But when it worked brutally well. One German pilot in particular began to stand out. His interception rate exceeded that of his peers. His engagements were efficient, deliberate, and consistent. British analysts studying loss reports noticed that his activity coincided with spikes in missing aircraft along specific corridors. What troubled them most was not the raw numbers, but the implication. If this system could be refined, scaled, and replicated, Britain's night bombing campaign could be strangled before it reached decisive strength. The response from the Allied side was cautious, constrained by uncertainty and limited alternatives. Night bombing had been adopted precisely because daylight operations had proven unsustainable. Shifting tactics again carried enormous risk. Countermeasures were discussed, but few were immediately available. Radar jamming was still experimental. Escort fighters lacked the range and night capability to protect bombers deep into enemy territory. Crews were already operating at the limits of endurance, navigating without visual references, relying on rudimentary instruments and dead reckoning. Increasing defensive firepower added weight and reduced range, while tighter formations made bombers more predictable. Every solution created new vulnerabilities. Meanwhile, the German night fighter threat continued to grow in confidence. For the pilot at the center of British concern, each successful mission reinforced the effectiveness of his method. He refined his approach, learned bomber behavior, and exploited the psychological strain on Allied crews who now knew they were being hunted in the dark. British leadership understood the stakes. Strategic bombing was not a peripheral effort. It was central to Britain's ability to remain on the offensive, while its ground forces were still rebuilding. If bomber losses continued to rise unchecked, the entire concept of nighttime air war would collapse. For a dangerous stretch of the war, Britain was reacting rather than adapting, trying to understand a threat that was evolving faster than its defenses. In that narrow window, the advantage lay with the hunter, not the hunted. And as long as that imbalance persisted, the fate of the air war rested uncomfortably close to the skill and judgment of a single German pilot. By early 1942, the night air war had reached a critical point. Bomber Command was flying deeper into occupied Europe, increasing both the scale and frequency of its operations, and German night fighter defenses were improving just as quickly. Radar coverage expanded, ground controllers refined their coordination, and pilots gained experience in a form of combat that rewarded patience and precision over aggression. For one German pilot in particular, this period marked the height of effectiveness. His success rate climbed steadily, and his presence was felt far beyond his own unit. British crews began to speak, quietly and unofficially, of certain routes and altitudes as cursed. Aircraft disappeared without radio calls, without flares, sometimes without any trace at all. Loss reports accumulated faster than explanations. The psychological impact was profound. Flying at night had once offered a sense of concealment and relative safety. Now it felt like exposure. Crews knew they could be tracked, intercepted, and destroyed without ever seeing their attacker. This pilot's success did not rely on overwhelming force, but on exploiting predictability. Bomber streams followed similar paths. Timetables repeated. Navigation errors funneled aircraft into narrow corridors. He studied these patterns relentlessly. His approach was methodical. He avoided unnecessary risks, conserved ammunition, and disengaged when conditions were unfavorable. In a war increasingly defined by mass production and scale, his effectiveness was unsettling precisely because it was personal. Each victory was the result of judgment, not volume. For British leadership, the situation was becoming unsustainable. Loss rates, while still tolerable on paper, were eroding the foundations of the bombing campaign. Training pipelines struggled to replace experienced crews. Morale suffered quietly but steadily. The question was no longer whether German night fighters posed a threat, but whether that threat could be contained before it expanded beyond control. Intelligence assessments warned that if German interception methods were further refined, bomber losses could rise to levels that would force a pause or even a suspension of operations. Such a pause would have been strategically disastrous. Britain's ability to strike back, to demonstrate relevance within the Allied coalition, depended on keeping pressure on Germany. Meanwhile, the German pilot at the center of Allied concern continued to operate with increasing confidence. His success fed back into the system that supported him. Controllers trusted his judgment. Commanders pointed to his results as proof that the night defense concept worked. Resources flowed accordingly. This created a dangerous feedback loop. The more effective he became, the more the system reinforced itself. For a brief but critical period, it appeared conceivable that Germany could impose a ceiling on British bombing efforts not through brute force, but through selective excellence. The war did not hinge on this pilot alone, but his performance exposed a structural vulnerability at the heart of Allied strategy. Britain was discovering in real time that individual mastery combined with emerging technology could threaten even the most carefully planned campaigns. If a solution did not emerge quickly, the night skies over Europe could become a domain where Britain paid an unsustainable price simply to remain in the war. The turning point did not come through a single dramatic breakthrough, but through accumulation. By mid-1942, the Allies began to respond in ways that fundamentally altered the balance of the night-air war. New tactics were introduced quietly and methodically. Bomber streams were deliberately concentrated to overwhelm German control systems. Navigation aids improved, reducing predictable flight paths and minimizing the corridors that night fighters had learned to exploit. Most importantly, electronic countermeasures entered operational use. Radar jamming confused German ground controllers, false echoes cluttered screens, and coordination between interceptor and target began to break down. These measures were imperfect at first, but they did not need to be flawless. They only needed to disrupt the delicate chain of detection, guidance, and interception on which German night fighters depended. For the pilot who had once operated with near-clinical efficiency, the environment changed abruptly. Targets became harder to locate. Interceptions failed more often. Fuel was wasted chasing false contacts. The margin that had once favored discipline and patience narrowed. At the same time, the sheer scale of Allied production began to assert itself. Losses, while still painful, could now be absorbed. Crews rotated, training expanded, and aircraft numbers increased faster than Germany could respond. What had once been a contest of skill became a contest of systems, and systems favored the side with depth, flexibility, and industrial reach. This shift did not erase the pilots' earlier achievements, nor did it diminish their significance. For a critical window, his performance had exposed a vulnerability that could have altered the trajectory of the war had it remained unaddressed. But individual brilliance, no matter how exceptional, could not ultimately overcome the structural realities of a global conflict. Germany lacked the capacity to scale success faster than the Allies could adapt. As American industry entered the war and Allied cooperation deepened, the night skies grew increasingly hostile for German defenders. Fuel shortages worsened, aircraft availability declined, experienced crews were lost and could not be replaced at the same rate. By late 1942 and into 1943, the balance had shifted decisively. The bombing campaign intensified rather than collapsed. Cities burned, factories were damaged, and Germany was forced onto the defensive in every domain. In retrospect, the danger lay not in the idea that one pilot could win the war alone, but in how close a single point of excellence came to destabilizing an entire strategy. His story reveals the fragile moments where history balances on narrow margins before mass, production, and coordination reassert control. World War II was ultimately decided by systems rather than individuals, but systems are not invulnerable. For one unsettling stretch of the war, Britain came closer than it realized to losing control of the night-air war. That it did not was not inevitable. It was the result of rapid adaptation, relentless iteration, and a race against time that was nearly lost.